The snow had turned to slush by morning, gray and heavy, seeping into the hem of her skirt as she walked. Her boots were too thin for the cold, the soles worn near through, and every step brought a new ache to her joints. The wind came hard from the west, dry and sharp, and it whipped her hair loose beneath her bonnet, stinging her cheeks red. She did not bother to fix it. No one was watching. No one had watched for a long time. The baby cried softly against her chest, muffled by the thin shawl she had wrapped around them both. She did not hush him. Let him cry. Let the world hear what it had done. The station behind her was just a squat frame of wood and coal smoke, now shrinking into the distance. There was no name on the sign. She had not bothered to read it. The letter she had carried in her pocket for weeks was smeared with rain and sweat, the edges torn from being read too many times. She hadn't looked at it since stepping off the train. She didn't need to anymore. The name at the bottom, Elias Boone, was etched into her now, just like the cold in her bones. The children followed behind her in a thin, quiet line, 8 shadows strung out like fence posts in the mud. The eldest, Martha, held the hand of the youngest, who could walk, dragging her along when she slowed. The rest did not speak. They knew better. Hunger had long since taught them silence. A wagon waited at the edge of the platform, the kind built for hauling feed or timber, not people. No seat, no cover. The man standing beside it watched her with a kind of stillness she did not trust. He didn't smile, didn't offer a hand, just nodded once and looked at the children. She met his eyes, briefly gray like the sky, like ash left too long in the stove, and then looked away. "You Ruth?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "Get in, then." That was all. She lifted the baby higher on her hip and climbed up into the wagon, wincing as her knees gave a small protest. The boards were slick with melt and worn smooth. The children scrambled in beside her, crowding together for what little warmth they could find. The man said nothing more. He climbed up front, snapped the reins, and they started west. The road was little more than a frozen rut, winding through patches of dead grass and empty fields. Fences leaned sideways under the weight of snow. Crows wheeled in the sky, fat and unbothered. She did not ask where they were going. He had written her once, "I got land. Got a place. I could use help." No promises. No kindness in the words. Just fact. The wagon rattled on for hours. When the baby cried again, she opened her coat and nursed him, her fingers stiff with cold, her face turned from the wind. No one looked away. They had all seen worse. By the time the wagon stopped, her skirt was stiff with ice and her teeth hurt from clenching them. The ranch was no more than a cluster of buildings, barn, shed, cabin, weathered gray and hunched low against the wind. Smoke rose thin from a chimney. A dog barked once, then fell silent. He climbed down first, then turned toward the back. "You'll stay in the cabin. There's 2 rooms. I'll sleep in the barn." She opened her mouth, not sure what she meant to say, but the words didn't come. Instead, she nodded. She gathered the children and led them down one by one, steadying them as they slipped on the ice. Inside the cabin was cold but clean. The floorboards creaked. A stove stood in the corner, already lit, throwing out a small ring of warmth. There were beds. Not enough for all of them, but more than they'd had in weeks. A table with chairs. A cupboard with flour, beans, salt. Real food. She felt her knees go again, but this time she sank to the floor. Just for a moment. Just long enough to breathe. The man stood in the doorway, hat in hand, face unreadable. "I'll be up early," he said. "There's work if you're able." She looked up at him, then at her children huddled near the stove, eyes wide and watchful. "I'm able," she said. He nodded once, then stepped outside the door, closing behind him with a soft thud. She sat there in the half-light, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the walls. The baby stirred against her chest, then settled again. She let her hand rest on the floor, palm open. Solid wood. A place. Not much, but something. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was falling. The morning came hard. Pale light leaked through the window before the warmth did. She rose before the fire went out, coaxed it back to life with trembling fingers and what little kindling she could find near the hearth. The children still slept, curled like pups beneath the threadbare quilts. She watched them for a moment, her eyes catching on Martha's face, jaw tight. Even in sleep, her hands clenched. Too old already. Too much burden. Outside, the wind cut sharper than the day before. Ruth tied her coat tight and stepped into the cold. Her boots crunched across the frost-bitten ground, each step pulling something deep from her legs. She found him by the barn, already working, breaking ice from the water trough with a rusted iron bar. He looked up, gave her one long glance, then turned back to the task. "Know anything about cows?" "No." "Can you lift a feed sack?" "Yes." He nodded. That was enough. He handed her a pitchfork, showed her how to spread hay without wasting it, where the frozen feed sat, what to watch for in the cattle's eyes in their movement. He didn't speak much, and she didn't ask. She followed the rhythm of his body instead, how he moved, how he worked. His strength wasn't loud. It was the kind that came from long days and harder winters. She recognized it. It was the only kind that lasted. By mid-morning her arms ached and her back screamed, but she didn't stop. The pain was familiar, and in a strange way it steadied her. She had carried children buried too, stood over her husband's grave with a face dry from too much crying. This was simpler, hard but honest. He brought her coffee in a tin mug, steaming and bitter. She drank it like medicine, her hands shaking from the heat. He didn't ask where she came from, didn't pry into the silence she carried like a second skin. He just watched her hands as she worked. Later he showed her the pump behind the barn, the woodpile, the tack room. "There's chickens," he said. "They need tending too. Eggs when they're not too cold. Feeds in the sack by the co-op. Watch for foxes." She nodded. Every word was a task. Every task a reason to move. That night she washed her hands in a basin of melted snow and laid the baby down in the corner bed, wrapped tight. The children had eaten stew, real stew, and gone to sleep with full bellies for the first time in weeks. She sat alone at the table, the stove ticking softly behind her. He came to the door with his hat in his hands again, the same way he had the night before. He didn't come in. "You did good," he said. She didn't look up, just nodded. "Thank you." He stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked into the dark. Days passed, then a week. The work settled into her bones like warmth after frostbite, dull at first, then burning. Her muscles hardened. Her steps grew faster. She began to know the cattle by their faces, knew the hens that pecked hardest and the mule that balked near the fence. She taught the children to sweep, to carry water, to listen for the creak of the gate. He didn't speak much more, but he started leaving things behind. A scarf by the door for Martha. A small bundle of nails for the shed where the wind got in. One morning, a book on the table, old dog-eared but full of stories. She read it to them by firelight, her voice hoarse but steady. One evening she stood outside after supper, arms crossed against the wind. The sun had slipped low, bleeding orange into the horizon. He came from the barn, coat dusted with straw, eyes squinting into the cold. "Used to be my brother's place," he said, voice low. She didn't answer, just waited. "He passed 6 winters ago. Fever. I came back to keep it from falling to ruin." She looked at the barn, at the sagging fence line, the broken wagon wheel leaning against the shed. "You've kept it," she said. He nodded, and his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Then silence again. But this one was warmer. Shared. She turned toward the house. "I'll get the children inside," Ruthie said, and she stopped. He met her eyes for the first time in days. Really met them. "You're doing more than I expected. More than most would." Her throat tightened, sudden and sharp. She swallowed it down. "There wasn't anywhere else to go," she said. He nodded but didn't look away. "You're not just here," he said. "You're building something." She didn't answer, but as she turned back to the cabin, she felt it in her chest, something loosening, like thawed earth, ready to be worked. The West doesn't rush. Subscribe and take the long road. The storm rolled in 2 days later, quiet at first, just a pale haze on the horizon like smoke rising from the land itself. By nightfall it had swallowed the sky. Snow came heavy, not in flakes but in fists, pounding the roof and shoving against the door until the hinges groaned. Inside, the stove burned hot. The children huddled near it with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Ruth moved through the small space like a shadow, checking windows, adding wood, keeping the fire alive. She felt the storm in her chest the same way she'd felt childbirth and bad news, slow and deep, a knowing kind of ache. Elias knocked once before entering. He was covered in snow-coat-crusted white gloves, stiff with ice. He didn't speak, just stomped his boots and moved to the fire. The room seemed to tighten when he stepped in, but none of the children flinched anymore. They were learning his quiet, too. "The barn roof's holding," he said after a long moment. "Horses are calm. Should make it through." She nodded, poured him coffee. He took it with a small thank you, then sat near the stove, stretching his fingers toward the heat. "They always this bad?" she asked, not because she needed the answer, but because she wanted to hear his voice. "Worse sometimes. Lost a cow once. Froze standing up." She gave a tired smile. "Everything around here seems to freeze before it dies." He looked at her, then really looked, and his face changed, not with pity, but something softer, like recognition. "You didn't freeze," he said. She didn't know what to say to that. When the storm passed, it left the world carved clean. Snowdrifts piled high against the fences. Icicles hung like teeth from the eaves. Everything sparkled, but it was the kind of beauty that would kill you if you stared too long. They worked in silence that day, shoveling paths, checking animals, hauling water by hand. Her body hurt in every corner, but it was a good hurt. Earned. Later, she found Elias in the shed, hammering a loose hinge. He didn't hear her come up. For a moment she watched him, his hands steady, his shoulders set like stone. Then she cleared her throat. "I can fix the torn gate," she said. He nodded. "Tools are by the wall. If the wind's still bad, brace it with rope until I can cut new boards." She liked that he didn't tell her to be careful. He trusted she would be. That night she sat at the table after the children were asleep, sorting through an old box he had brought in from the barn. It was filled with buttons, scraps of cloth, broken bits of things someone once thought might be useful again. She didn't ask whose it had been. She didn't need to. He sat across from her, sipping tea, hands wrapped around the mug. "My father built this place," he said after a long silence. "With his hands. Said a man was only worth what he could hold together." She nodded, her fingers sifting through the pieces. "My husband said the same, then ran off with a bottle and a sickness he never came back from." Elias didn't look shocked. He just nodded, like he'd known 100 stories that ended like that. "I used to think I wasn't enough," she said, quieter now. "Too many children. Too little left to give. Some days I still wonder." He leaned forward, slow and careful. "You walked into a blizzard with 8 mouths to feed and no promise of warmth at the end of it. Don't tell me you're not enough." Her hands stopped moving. The words hung in the air, heavier than snow. "Thank you," she whispered, not because it felt like enough, but because it was all she had. The next morning he left a pair of wool mittens on the table. They were too big, but they were warm. She slipped them on and went out to the yard, her breath curling in the air, and for the first time she felt herself smiling for no reason at all. It wasn't love yet. Not quite. But it was something that could survive the frost. Spring came slow to the plains. The thaw was not gentle. It came in bursts and silences, in mud and broken branches and water that crept under doors and into boots. The wind still carried a chill, but the light changed. It stayed longer. It touched things softer, and the earth, long dormant, began to stir. Ruth felt it in her bones first. The mornings didn't bite so hard. Her hands, though still cracked and rough, moved easier. The children spent more time outside, their laughter returning like birds after winter. She caught herself watching them, how they chased each other through the field behind the barn, how they found wonder in puddles and worms, and felt something tighten in her chest. Not pain, not exactly. Something like hope, but quieter. Elias built them a swing. He used an old board and rope he found in the loft. Said nothing about it, just tied it to the cottonwood by the chicken coop and gave it a push to test the nut. By dusk, the younger ones were lined up barefoot in the grass, taking turns, their squeals cutting through the air like wild joy. She watched from the porch, hands wrapped around a mug, not drinking, just holding. He stood a few feet away, leaning on the post, chewing on a blade of grass like it meant something. "You always this handy?" she asked. He shrugged. "Comes from breaking more than I fix." She smiled. "That's still fixing." They didn't speak after that, just watched the sky turn amber behind the hills. He taught her to ride come May. She had not asked, and he did not offer with words. One morning he simply saddled the mare and led her to the cabin door. "She's calm," he said. "Won't buck if you're gentle." Ruth looked at the horse, then at him, unsure. "I haven't been on a horse since I was a girl." "She'll remember," he said. "And so will you." He was right. Her balance came back faster than she thought it would. Her body remembered what it felt like to move with something alive. The land looked different from that height, wider, closer, less like a threat and more like something waiting. They rode the fence line that day. He pointed out where the wire needed patching, where the coyotes had been. She listened, asked questions. Her laughter came without warning when the mare tossed her head and tried to trot. "You're not bad at this," he said. "Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not." And something passed between them, nothing spoken, but something certain. The distance between them began to shrink, not all at once, but in quiet ways. He started taking supper with them once or twice a week, said it was easier than cooking beans alone in the barn. She pretended to believe him. He told her about his mother, a hard woman with a soft spot for lilacs, about a sister who had died young, about how he never meant to stay on the land this long but couldn't seem to leave it either. And she told him about her father's hands, how they smelled of tobacco and horses, about the first time she saw the ocean, about the ache of childbirth and the worse ache of burying a name no one else would remember. They didn't talk about what they were, didn't call it anything. But sometimes when she handed him a tool or brushed past him at the pump, their fingers would touch, brief, accidental, and she would feel it deep, like a seed taking root. One evening she found him fixing the fence near the west pasture shirt, damp, with sweat hammer in hand. The sky was wide open above him, bruised with the colors of dusk. She brought him water, stood beside him as he worked. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then she asked, "Why did you write that letter?" He didn't stop hammering, just said didn't know how else to ask for someone. She waited. He finally turned to her. "I thought I needed help. What I needed was something to matter to." The wind picked up, then soft through the tall grass. She stepped closer, close enough to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the dirt beneath his nails, the way he was trying not to reach for her. She touched his arm. "You matter," she said. And that was all. The trouble came from the east. A rider, dust-covered and thin, showed up just after planting. Ruth was outside stringing beans along the fence with the children when the figure crested the ridge. She shaded her eyes, heart thudding with an old unwelcome rhythm. Elias came out from the barn, jaw tight, shoulders squared. The man dismounted slow. His coat hung off him like an old rag. He looked once at Ruth, then at Elias, and spat into the dirt. "Didn't expect to see your kind playing house," he said. Ruth felt Martha move closer beside her. Elias said nothing. "Who is he?" she asked, voice low. "Brother Elias," muttered. "Half. Haven't seen him in 6 years." The man laughed dry. "That was your choice, not mine. But I heard about your little arrangement. You got yourself a woman and a whole parade of mouths to feed?" "That right." Ruth's hand went instinctively to the baby's back. She felt heat rising in her chest, rage, fear, and something colder. The man stepped closer. "I got a lawyer up in Cheyenne, says this land was never signed over proper. Pa's will don't mention your name, Elias." "Not once." Elias didn't flinch. "You want to fight over the dirt, then fight. But don't come to my home and insult the people living in it." "Your home," the man sneered. "You think this is yours just 'cause you stayed and I didn't? You think building fences makes it a kingdom?" Ruth stepped forward then, before she could think better of it. "It's his because he bled for it," she said. "Because he fed it, and it fed him back. Where were you when the storms came, when the barn caved in, when the calves died? Where were you when his hands cracked open from the cold?" The man looked at her like she'd slapped him. "You're nothing to me," he said. She held his gaze. "And you're less than that to us." He turned then, too quick to be brave, mounted up, spat once more, and rode off, kicking dust in his wake. But his words lingered like smoke. That night Elias was quiet, sat with his elbows on the table, his eyes fixed on the floor. The children had gone to bed early. The room was dim. Ruth stood at the sink, drying the same plate over and over again. "Was he right?" she asked finally. Elias looked up. "About what?" "What?" "The will. The land." He nodded once. "It's complicated." She turned toward him. "Is it his?" "No," he said. "It was left to Ma, not Pa. But he'll fight it anyway. Try to drag me through court just to win something back." "Can he?" "I don't know," Elias said. "But it doesn't matter." She stepped closer, drying rags still in hand. "Doesn't matter?" she asked. He stood then, fast and tired. "I don't care what papers say. I care what I've built. I care who's under this roof. If I have to, I'll build another damn house on different land and start over." She looked at him, really looked. At the lines of him, the fire behind the weariness, the way his fists curled, not with anger but with resolve. "Not alone," she said. He didn't answer, just stepped forward and rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that for a long time, not moving, not needing to. The letter came a week later, folded clean, stamped with a law office seal. Elias opened it outside, then burned it before she could read it. His hands were steady. "What's it say?" she asked. He stared at the flame, licking the edges of the envelope. "He wants his peace. Says if I give him a share of the cattle, he'll leave the land." She waited. "I'm not giving him a thing." "Then what do we do?" He looked at her, then at the barn, the hills, the field where the swing still hung. "We hold fast," he said. And for the first time since he'd come back to this land, he looked like a man who had something to lose and every reason not to lose it. June came hot and dry. The sky turned to brass most days, and the wind blew like breath from a kiln. Dust crept into everything, into boots, into bedsheets, into the creases behind the children's ears. The well ran low by evening, and they rationed water without complaint. It was the way of things. You made do or you didn't. The tension from the letter still hovered, but it changed shape. It wasn't panic anymore. It was weight. the kind of pressure that forged something harder beneath the surface. Ruth and Elias moved through the days like a team yoked together, not always speaking but always seeing. They filed the counterclaim in town. Elias came home with ink on his fingers and a new hollow behind his eyes. He didn't talk about the courthouse, and Ruth didn't press. She could feel how much it cost him just to ask the law to listen. Still, the work didn't stop. The beans came up stringy but green. 2 calves were born in the same night, one breech, and Ruth had blood up to her elbows by dawn. She didn't flinch, just cleaned her hands in the creek and went back to feeding the hens. Later, Elias found her sitting by the edge of the pasture, staring at nothing. He stood beside her without a word, then lowered himself to the ground. "I should been there," he said. "You were fixing the pump. I could—" She turned her head, eyes narrowing. "I did it. It's done." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're not what I expected. I'm not what anyone expected." "Good." That night, after the children were asleep and the lantern burned low, she told him about the man she'd married at 17, all grin and promises. About the charm that soured to silence, to fists, to empty bottles on the porch. About the way he left one night and never came back, and how she'd prayed not for his return, but for his body to be found, just so she could stop waiting. Elias didn't move, didn't offer comfort or comment. He just sat there, elbows on his knees, listening like her words were something sacred. When she finished, he spoke so softly she almost didn't hear it. "You deserve better." She looked away, not trusting her voice. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," he said. "I'm just here, if you want me to be." She blinked hard. "That's the first offer anyone's ever given me, with no strings." He gave a tired smile. "I don't like knots." The court date was set for mid-July. Word came in a plain envelope with no return address. Ruth read it twice, then folded it neat and set it on the shelf. "We'll ride in together," Elias said. "Face it head on." She nodded. "And if we lose?" He shrugged. "Then we start again, with what matters." And somehow in that moment she believed him. Not because he said it, but because everything he had done proved it true. The week before the hearing, Ruth found a piece of soft leather and stitched a pouch for the baby's first shoes. They were worn and small, one toe chewed by the dog last winter. She tied the pouch shut and tucked it in the drawer beside her bed. That same day, Elias carved a length of wood into something smooth and careful. It was a toy horse, rough but balanced. He didn't say who it was for, but she saw how his hand lingered on it. They were building things. Small things, but things that lasted. The morning they left for town, the children stood on the porch, waving until they were out of sight. The older ones would watch the younger. The neighbor boy would check in by dusk. It was only one night, but it felt like crossing into something they couldn't come back from. Ruth rode beside Elias in the wagon, their hands not touching but close. The sky stretched wide overhead, endless and unforgiving. But she didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. The courthouse in town stood like a bully, wide-shouldered, sun-bleached and smug in its symmetry. Ruth had never been inside one before. She hadn't expected it to smell like dust and floor polish. She hadn't expected the silence. They sat in the back while the clerk shuffled papers and the judge read with heavy eyes. Elias wore his cleanest shirt. She had braided her hair back tight and borrowed boots from a neighbor woman in town, 2 sizes too big but polished to a shine. When the half-brother arrived, he made a show of looking around like he owned the place. He wore city clothes now, pinstripes and slicked hair, and a thin smile that never reached his eyes. The hearing was short. The brothers' lawyers spoke in polished words about inheritance, bloodlines, rightful claim. Elias sat still, his jaw locked, his hands loose in his lap. When asked to speak, he stood slowly. He didn't glance at Ruth, but she could feel his steadiness like heat through the floorboards. This land was never a gift, he said. It was work. Every fence, every seed, every cow born in the dark, I did that. No one else. I didn't come here to fight a man over a name on a paper. I came to keep a life from falling apart. The judge asked a question. Elias answered plain. Then Ruth was called. She walked to the front with her heart hammering like hooves. She didn't know the law. She didn't know the right words. But she knew the truth. This isn't about land, she said. It's about pride. That man showed up one day and tried to scare us off. He never fed a cow or buried one. He never boiled snow for water when the well froze. He wants what he didn't earn. The judge looked at her pen still, waiting. I have 8 children, she said, and every one of them knows the difference between something taken and something built. They didn't speak much on the wagon ride home. The sun was high and the wheels groaned in the ruts. Ruth sat with her arms folded, eyes on the road. You were brave, Elias said. I was angry. Both can be true. They stopped near the ridge to rest the mule. Ruth walked a few paces away, standing where the hills dropped off into wide, dry country. She felt him come up behind her. Not close, just near. What if we win? She asked. Then we plant more oats. And if we lose, then we find other dirt to make our own. She turned to look at him. Would you still want us if the land was gone? He met her eyes. It was never the land that made me stay. Her chest hurt sudden and full, but it was a good hurt, like breath after being underwater too long. They arrived home by dusk. The children came running down the path barefoot and dusty, shouting stories, clinging to her arms and legs. Elias helped down the baby and set him gently on the porch. Martha stood back a little, watching Ruth the way she used to watch the sky, unsure what might fall. Ruth crouched, touched her daughter's face, and smiled. We're still here, she said. The verdict came in a letter the next week. She opened it in the kitchen sun pouring through the window. Elias stood beside her, quiet. They won. The land stayed theirs. No fanfare. No reward. Just a few lines of text and the weight of something lifting that had pressed down for too long. Ruth set the letter aside and turned back to the bread rising on the stove. She pressed her hands into the dough, felt it yield, rise again. Outside, the swing creaked in the wind. A rooster crowed too late. A child laughed. The land was still hard. The work hadn't ended. But they were building something together. The wedding was not planned. There were no guests, no lace, no vows read from folded pages. No rings, even just a copper button from one of Elias's old shirts strung on a bit of twine and tied around Ruth's finger by candlelight. It happened on a Sunday after supper, with stew still warm on the table, and the children piled around the stove in a nest of quilts. Elias had cleared his throat once awkwardly. Ruth had looked up, half smiling. I don't want to be just the man who shares your land, he said. She didn't answer right away, just set down her cup and looked at him long and steady. Then she nodded. All right. And that was all. The next morning she stood in the yard watching the sun rise over the fields. The earth was turning green again, slow and stubborn. Wildflowers pushed up through cracks in the dry soil, bold as anything. Behind her, Elias stepped onto the porch, his face softer than usual. You're up early, he said. I couldn't sleep. Bad dreams. No, she said. I just wanted to see it. The morning. Like this. He came and stood beside her, both of them facing the fields. It's different now, she said. He nodded. It'll keep changing. She didn't mind. Change didn't scare her anymore. They spent the day working. That was their celebration, digging, planting, mending. The fence along the west side had nearly come down over the winter. Elias hauled new rails while Ruth held them in place, hammering the nails with her usual precision. The baby toddled through the grass, eating dandelions. The boys ran half-naked in the sun, kicking up dust. The girls hung laundry and sang old songs off-key. It was the kind of day you'd forget in its parts, but whole it stayed. That summer they built a new shed from salvaged wood and sweat. She painted the cabin door blue. He taught the oldest boys how to shape a saddle cinch. The baby said his first word mine and made a kingdom out of a pile of rags. Ruth found herself laughing more. Not the brittle kind from before, but real laughter, deep belly, full sudden as thunder. One night she lay in bed beside Elias, her back to his chest, and whispered, "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again." He didn't say anything at first. Then, it's not safety. It's love. Feels similar, but it holds longer. She turned to look at him. "You sure?" "I'm sure of you." By September, the garden overflowed. Tomatoes, corn beans. Enough to share? She packed jars with the girls, lined the pantry shelves, and sent baskets to the widow 2 farms over. Elias fixed the school roof in town and came back with ink on his hands and news in his eyes. "They're offering land to teachers," he said. "Small plots. If we taught reading, maybe some math." She looked at him. "You want to?" "I think we could." So they did. Each night 2 or 3 children from nearby farms came to their cabin, sat on stools and crates, and learned to shape letters. Ruth read aloud, her voice low and warm. Elias taught them how numbers worked in cattle and crops, how to reckon a fair trade. The land fed them. Now they fed others. One evening near the year's end, Ruth stood at the window watching the light fade. Snow dusted the fields. Smoke curled from the chimney. The house smelled of stew, rosemary, and bread. The baby slept against her shoulder, soft breath warming her collarbone. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into him, eyes on the sky. "Feels like we're not just surviving anymore," she said. "No," he murmured. "We're not." He kissed her temple. The children's laughter rang down the hallway. A fire cracked in the stove. She closed her eyes. This was not the life she had dreamed of. It was better. The trail grows quieter but not empty. Subscribe.